We're going to be in Mark chapter 7 this morning. You would grab it. As you are getting there, there's a couple of things that I would like to talk about. First of all, you might notice that every Sunday I have a routine that I have a glass of ice water up here on the platform with me. It is a tradition that occurs every Sunday up on this platform that I have a glass of ice water to keep my throat nice and wet as I present the Word of God to you. I have another one. In fact, Heather and I learned this one from Rob and Patty, but that I have a tradition every morning that I engage in. And when I don't do it, my life feels awkward. In my normal morning tradition, I get up, I don't even like brush my teeth or anything. I go to my couch and I grab my Bible and I read and I pray. That's the first thing I do every morning because I figure I don't have anything good to say to anyone until I've heard something from the Lord. That's just the way that it is. If I open my mouth before I have an opportunity to talk with Jesus, I'm probably going to say something I shouldn't say. So that is the first thing that I do every morning. The second thing I do is that I go and I make a pot of coffee. And I make that pot of coffee, and as I'm making that pot of coffee, I then go to the bathroom, and I go through all of the necessary bathroom routines. I brush my teeth, I take a shower, I get dressed, all of those wonderful things, right? But the very next thing that I do is that I then grab 2 cups of coffee, and I sit down in the chair, and Heather's in the recliner, and then I take the next, 20 minutes, half hour, to simply sit with my wife for a little while before the rest of my day begins. And that is my morning routine, my tradition, if you will, that I have every morning. Those traditions are not bad, and I want us to remind ourselves, many of you probably have those types of traditions or routines. I was just hearing from someone yesterday that they drink a thermos of coffee like this, and then they stop at Dunkin' Donuts every morning for a cup of coffee. That's part of their morning routine, their morning tradition. And so let's read this from Mark 7 together, starting in verse 1 through verse 23. Now when the Pharisees gathered to Jesus with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled. That is, they were unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And Jesus said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.' But you say, 'If a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God,' then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do." And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." This is the word of the Lord for the nurture and admonition of his people today. Thanks be to God. we are an interesting group of people. We are people, humans in general, just are people that fall into traditions. We have traditions. We have routines. We have, this is another word for traditions, it's just a routine. It's something we do. It's something that has meaning to us or has purpose to us in some form or fashion. In Protestant circles like our own, it can be easy for us to kind of point the finger at non-Protestant traditions to say, oh, they are full of tradition and not full of relationship. And that I go, okay, there is always the potential for something like that to happen. But I would like us to recognize that we in the Protestant realm of the church are full of traditions as well. In fact, just to give some context to what this is that do you realize that just simply what we are doing this morning by gathering together and singing songs as an expression of worship is actually a tradition of the church? In the New Testament, particularly using an instrument, by the way, in the New Testament, there is no explicit command for us to actually be using instruments in the church. That the only thing that the New Testament shares with us is that we should sing songs to one another. And so, which is the reason why actually some Protestant churches do not allow any instrument in their sanctuary. But that the only type of music that they provide is singing. And that quite frankly, the invention of music that we have, that we use for worship in our congregations, is really an invention of the last 300 years. And so that this, if we were in the church 1,300 years ago, 1,400 years ago, 1,500 years ago, that what we would be doing in worship is we would sing, but we would sing what is known as antiphonally. Meaning that this side of the congregation would sing, and then this side of the congregation would sing in response. And that they would go back and forth. And that is the way that the worship of the church lasted for hundreds of years. And so that we have established, and if we didn't have music in the church, some people go, we didn't worship today. And so that this is actually an established tradition that we have. This is just one example. There are many, many more. But that Jesus in this conversation, the reason I bring that up, let me finish that point. The reason I bring that up is to recognize that we are all conditioned in some form or fashion by the traditions that we have grown up in. Whether that is you came to faith and you were 5 years old, and that you grew up in a very traditional setting, and that you grew up in a setting in which word and table and a liturgy and a priest and robes and vestments, that was a tradition that shaped and formed you. Or that you came to faith like I did in my late teens after I was out of high school, and that my experience with the church was one of a low church experience with various music styles, and that the preaching of the word was central. The reality is that I was shaped by the tradition in which I lived. I was molded. I was conditioned to believe certain things and to think certain things about my world. Doesn't mean that it's evil. Please hear that. There's a lot of good that comes out of that. It just means that that's the mode, the vehicle in which I was shaped. Jesus points out something that's very important for us in this passage, and it is what is the purpose of a tradition? What is the purpose of the traditions in which we have? Traditions always start as some type of innovation, just like music. Frankly, the chairs that you were sitting in this morning, if you were here with me, are an innovation of the church. Again, pews are only about 450 years old, and you're not sitting in pews if you're in this room with me. You're sitting in padded chairs that are only really about 75 years old. But that this is an innovation of the church, and that we have known of people, and you've probably heard of stories, that when pews get pulled out of churches, people say, I can't go to church there anymore because it's no longer a church because it doesn't have pews. But that if you went to church before the Reformation, if you were in church in the 1500s, more than likely you would have to stand for the entire service. And so it wasn't until that preachers started to preach longer than about 15 minutes that benches were started to be built in sanctuaries. That's the truth. When preachers started to preach 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, that's when people started to say, it'd be really nice if I could sit while I hear this guy talk. And that's when churches started to do this. And the wealthy were actually the first ones to do it. And they paid the money to have these benches built so they could sit. So that this tradition of a pew, that some people say a church can't be a church without a pew or a chair in it, it was actually an innovation of the church that occurred only about 450 years ago. Just to kind of put this into perspective, I say we are shaped and molded by traditions. But Jesus shares with us what is the purpose of good traditions. What is the purpose of good tradition? It's actually found right in verse 8, in verse 9. Let's grab hold of it. That Jesus says this, you leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. So what he's communicating here is that the tradition of men, in this case, is opposed to the commandment of God. Now, there are lots of traditions that aren't opposed to the commandment of God, but what is he getting at? What is he getting at? Is that traditions are meant to be in support of whatever this mysterious commandment of God is. Now, I want us to think about this. You have a fine way of rejecting, again, the commandment of God in verse 9 in order to establish your tradition. I think it's incredibly, incredibly important that Jesus used the singular here. You have rejected the commandment, not the commandments, but the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. I think what Jesus is getting at here is he's pointing to the fact that your traditions are not allowing you to love God and to love neighbor. And that this is actually supported by the example that he gives of what would be able to be given to parents to support them being given to the treasury, the temple treasury, and not being allowed to help the parents anymore. That the parents are not being loved and honored any longer because of the tradition that they had. We'll get to there in a minute. But that this points towards something very important. That traditions, the purpose of good traditions, the purpose of the tradition of reading the scripture in church, the purpose of the tradition of singing the praises of God in church, the tradition of praying and kneeling at an altar, the tradition of, particularly in a tradition like the Church of the Nazarene, that we have altars in our church buildings. The tradition that you would use the altar as a place of prayer and a place of worship, that those traditions were always meant to help us be taught, to be trained to love God and love people. That is the purpose of every good tradition. That the tradition started for the purpose of training us how to love God. I'm going to give you another example from my own life. I mentioned to you early already that the first thing that I do every morning is that I go to my couch and I grab my Bible and I read and I pray, because I recognize that there's a very good possibility that if I speak to somebody before I pray and have a conversation with Jesus, there's a good shot that what's going to come out of my mouth probably should not. That tradition of me sitting on the couch and praying and reading it has the purpose of me learning how to love God and love people well. Do you see it? That I have structured my life and have a tradition in my life that its sole purpose is for me to know that I am going to love God today and I'm going to love people well today. That doesn't mean it always works perfectly, because I'm imperfect, but that I know that is a tradition that I have been able to put into place that helps me to love God and to love people better than if I didn't do it. The tradition of sitting and drinking coffee with my spouse every morning is not just because I enjoy drinking coffee, which I do, but that it's there because I am training myself to learn how to love my wife as Christ has loved his church. And that if I take the time to make sure that I'm connected with her before I go about all of the rest of the things that I need to do in my day, that I recognize that I am showing the type of priority to the relationship and the commitment that I've made to her that is the type of commitment and priority that Jesus makes for us. Again, it's a tradition that establishes and roots me in the ability to be able to love God well and love my neighbor well. That is the purpose of every good tradition. Now, this is the problem, is that Jesus is confronted with a tradition by the Pharisees and the scribes in this text, and that the problem that he has is that these Pharisees and scribes have removed their tradition from the purpose of helping them love well. Let's take a look at this. So the first thing that they do is that they even ask the question in the beginning. Why do your disciples not adhere to the traditions of the elders? What the Pharisees and the scribes are doing is that they're using their tradition to begin to segregate and separate people. We are those who hold to the traditions. We are the ones who are the gatekeepers of what is healthy and holy and good, and that we know those who are in and those who are out because you do the tradition and you don't. So because you do the tradition, you're in, and because you don't do the tradition, you're out. And that we know that, and it's nice and clear and black and white. Those who go to church on Sunday, because that's the traditional thing we do, those who go to church on Sunday, they're in. Those who don't go to church on Sunday, they're out. Those who go to the bars, they're out. Those who smoke cigarettes, they're out. Those who read their Bible every day, they're in. You get the idea. That we can segregate people easily by the use of our tradition. But the problem is that the segregation and separation of people is not demonstrating an attitude of love towards God, who loves the person that is being shoved out, by the way, nor is it demonstrating a love for that person yourself. Because you're looking for a way to distance yourself from that person. You're looking for a way to potentially say that you're better than them. And so that this even just asking the question, the Pharisees are starting to demonstrate that the purpose of their tradition is not to learn how to love these disciples well. The purpose of their tradition is not to learn how to love Jesus well. The purpose of their tradition is not to learn how to love God well. The purpose of their tradition is to say who's in and who's out. The second thing that we learn from them, where the tradition starts to go astray, is actually in Jesus' response to them. This is amazing. Let's take a look. So in verse 5, the Pharisees and scribe asked Jesus the question. Let's take a look at it. Verse 5. And the Pharisees and scribe asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Now, this is a great question. And again, it demonstrates a little bit of their heart. But that what Jesus answers is actually intriguing. Because Jesus doesn't answer their question. He doesn't answer their question at all. Rather, he points the finger back at them and says, "Why are you asking me about traditions anyway?" Let's take a look what he says. Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written. Now, that word is big. Now, if you're not familiar with the root of the term hypocrite, is that a hypocrite was an actor. And that they would change masks in different scenes of the Greek drama. So that the idea was that you're one person in one place and you put the mask on and that you play the part very well to this crowd of people. But then when you're over in this crowd of people, you take that mask off and you put a different mask on and that you're very much different over here. This is what Jesus is getting at. But that the use of the tradition in this case is separated from loving God well, but rather is there to avoid actually having a transformational experience with the presence of God. Because a transformational experience with the presence of God would require that my mask over here that I'm wearing at school could not be put on, or that I'm wearing at work, or I'm wearing at the restaurant, or wherever I might be out in public, that I need to be the same person here that I am here, because God says that type of division is evil, and that God would bring it up to you. James is very clear that a double-minded man is unstable and should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. And so that the idea here is that if you are going to have a transformational experience in the presence of God, what it will do is that it will, instead of having two separate worlds, or three separate worlds, or four separate worlds, one at the club, one at the party, one at school, one at work, one at home, that all of those different people that you are in those different circumstances get reduced down to one human being. And that one human being that gets reduced down to when you come into the presence of God is a human being that says, Jesus Christ is the one who made me, and Jesus Christ is the one who has redeemed me, and I am going to follow him regardless of every circumstance, regardless of every position, place, time that I might find myself in, that my sole purpose and desire in life is that I would please him and follow him forever. And so we use the tradition to be able to check off the box and say, I've obligated this thing over here, and God must be happy with me because I've done the tradition that I need to do. I sang the right songs. I prayed the right prayers. I went to the right church. I even read my Bible on occasion at home, but that I'm still wearing the mask when I go out into public. And so that the tradition is used to avoid the confrontation of a real conversation with God. I want to lean into this a moment, because as I said earlier, I believe that God has a meeting for you today. Amen. I believe that God has a desire to communicate with you, to have conversation with you. In that the reality of it is that simply coming to church at 9 o'clock here, 9 o'clock Eastern time, on Sunday morning, can be as much of a tradition as any other tradition on the planet. In that you can use the coming to church at 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern time as a way to avoid having that life-transforming conversation with God. And I'm telling you that God does not want you to hide behind the tradition any longer. He longs for you to peel off the hypocritical masks that we wear in the different pieces of our lives and to have the confrontation with Him that you will be transformed into a new being in Jesus Christ. That is His desire for you this morning. Lean into it.